A young father went exploring a cave in Utah and never came back out. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't untrained. But within minutes, he made one wrong turn and got wedged headfirst in a tunnel no wider than a microwave. For the next 26 hours, hundreds of rescuers tried everything to save him. But the deeper they dug, the less time he had. And what happened in that final hour? It's something his family will never forget, and the cave still holds the answer. Now, before we dive into this heartbreaking story of John Edward Jones, trapped upside down in the Nutty Putty cave, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because what we're about to uncover isn't just about one man's final moments. It's about how quickly everything can change with a single wrong turn. So let's start with John Edward Jones himself. This wasn't some adrenaline junkie looking for his next thrill. John was 26 years old, a medical student at the University of Virginia, married to his college sweetheart Emily, and father to a 13-month-old daughter named Lizzie. By all accounts, he was the kind of guy you'd want as your doctor. You know, thoughtful, careful, the type who measured twice and cut once. But John had this thing for caving. Had been doing it since he was a kid with his family. And honestly, he was pretty good at it. Utah has some of the most incredible cave systems in the world, and John knew many of them like the back of his hand. So when Thanksgiving 2009 rolled around, and he was back home visiting family, it seemed natural that he'd want to take his younger brother Josh on a little underground adventure. That's how they ended up at Nutty Putty Cave. The cave that shouldn't exist now. Here's the thing about Nutty Putty Cave. It's not your typical tourist destination. This place is what cavers call a wild cave, meaning no lights, no paved paths, no safety railings. Just you, your headlamp, and about 1,400 feet of twisting limestone tunnels that were carved out over thousands of years by underground water. The cave got its name because, well, the clay inside has this weird, putty-like consistency that sticks to everything. But don't let the silly name fool you. This place has a reputation. It's tight. Like, really tight. Some passages are so narrow you have to exhale just to squeeze through them. And it's a maze down there, with dozens of side tunnels branching off in every direction. Local cavers had been exploring Nutty Putty since the 1960s, and over the years, they'd given names to different sections. There was the Big Slide, the maze, and then there was this notorious passage called the Birth Canal. Now, the Birth Canal was exactly what it sounds like. A tight, uncomfortable squeeze that supposedly mimicked, well, you get the idea. It was a rite of passage for experienced cavers. But here's what John didn't know that day. There was another tunnel, a dead end. One that looked almost identical to the Birth Canal entrance, but went absolutely nowhere. The wrong turn. November 24, 2009. John and Josh entered Nutty Putty Cave around 8 p.m. with a group of friends and family members. It was supposed to be a fun, nostalgic trip, you know. Show Josh some of the cool formations, maybe challenge him with the Birth Canal, if he was feeling up for it. They'd been exploring for about an hour when John decided to lead the group toward the Birth Canal. He'd done this passage before. Multiple times actually. But in the darkness, with only his headlamp cutting through the black, John took a left turn instead of a right. It's an easy mistake to make down there. The tunnels all look similar, especially when you're focused on not hitting your head on the low ceiling. So John starts crawling into what he thinks is the Birth Canal. He's going head first, which is normal for that passage. The tunnel starts narrow and gets wider as you go, like a funnel in reverse. Except, this wasn't the Birth Canal. This was an unmapped dead end that got narrower, not wider. By the time John realized something was wrong, he was already 400 feet from the main chamber, squeezed into a tunnel that was 18 inches wide and 10 inches high. That's smaller than most mailboxes, folks. And he was stuck. Not just stuck, completely wedged, upside down, with his arms pinned against his body and his legs somewhere up behind him. Now here's the terrifying part. When you're upside down for extended periods, gravity starts working against your cardiovascular system. Blood pools in your head and upper chest. Your heart has to work overtime just to circulate blood to your lower extremities. John had maybe 24 hours before his body would start shutting down. The clock was already ticking. The first rescue attempt, Josh realized something was wrong when John stopped responding to his calls. He crawled into the passage as far as he could, and could just barely see John's boots in the distance. That's when he knew they needed help. Serious help. The call went out around 9:30 p.m. Utah County Sheriff's Office, local fire departments, and experienced cave rescue teams from across the region started mobilizing. And let me tell you, these weren't just weekend warriors. Utah has some of the most skilled cave rescue specialists in the country because, well, they've had to be. The state's geology creates these kinds of emergencies more often than you'd think. By midnight, over 50 rescuers had arrived at the cave entrance. The plan was relatively straightforward. They'd send the smallest, most experienced cavers down to assess the situation, then figure out the best way to extract John safely. When the first rescuer, a guy named Susie Motola, finally reached John around 1 a.m., the news was both good and bad. Good news, John was conscious, talking, and seemed relatively stable. Bad news, he was wedged in there tight, really tight. They tried the obvious things first. Lubricate the passage with dish soap. Have John try to push backwards with his feet. Even brought in some small hydraulic jacks to try to widen the passage slightly. Nothing worked. If anything, John seemed to be getting more firmly stuck as time went on. The engineering challenge by dawn, on November 25th, this had become a full-scale rescue operation. Over 100 people were now involved, including structural engineers, rope access specialists, and even some folks from the local mining industry. They were setting up a command center at the cave entrance, running communication lines down to the trapped area, and trying to figure out how to extract a 200-pound man from a space the size of a large pizza box. The engineers came up with a plan that was both ingenious and terrifying. They would drill into the cave from above, creating a new access point closer to where John was trapped. Meanwhile, they set up a complex pulley system using high-strength cables and multiple anchor points to try to pull John backwards out of the narrow passage. But there was a problem. Well, several problems actually. First, they weren't entirely sure where John was in relation to the surface. The cave maps weren't that precise, and one wrong calculation could mean drilling right through him. Second, the limestone in this area was notoriously unstable. All that drilling and the vibrations from the machinery could potentially cause a cave-in. And third, there was John's condition to consider. He'd now been upside down for over 12 hours. Rescuers could talk to him through a communication system they'd rigged up. And while he was still conscious and talking, they could hear the strain in his voice. His speech was getting slower, more labored. The blood pooling in his head was starting to affect his cognitive function. FALSE. Hope around 2 p.m. on the 25th, the rescue team thought they'd caught a break. Using a series of ropes and pulleys, they managed to move John about 12 inches backward, out of the narrow part of the tunnel. It wasn't much, but it was progress. For the first time in almost 18 hours, there was genuine hope that they might actually get him out. John was even talking more clearly. The slight change in position had apparently relieved some of the pressure on his chest and head. He was asking about his family, making jokes with the rescuers, even discussing his medical studies. One rescuer later said it was like talking to any normal guy, just one who happened to be stuck in a really uncomfortable position. They kept working the pulley system, inch by careful inch. The plan was to get him back far enough that he could bend his knees and start to push himself out with his legs. If they could get him maybe 2 feet further back, he'd probably be able to self-rescue from there. But then, around 4 p.m., they heard a sound that every rescuer dreads. A loud crack, followed by the sickening sound of rope going slack. The breaking point, the main anchor point, had failed. All that pulling force, all those hours of tension, had been too much for the limestone anchor. When it gave way, John slid right back into the narrow passage, actually ending up in a slightly worse position than before. The rope that had been around his legs was now tangled, making the extraction even more complicated. But the worst part wasn't the mechanical failure, it was John's reaction. Up until that moment, he'd been relatively calm, cracking jokes, staying positive, but when he felt himself slide back into that narrow space, when he realized how close he'd come to freedom, something broke. Not physically, but emotionally. The rescuers could hear it in his voice over the communication system. The hope was gone. He started talking about his wife Emily, about his baby daughter Lizzie, about how he was supposed to be a doctor and help people, not end up trapped in some cave. He wasn't panicking exactly, but there was a resignation in his voice that was heartbreaking to hear. Meanwhile, above ground, word was spreading. Local news crews were setting up. John's family had arrived and were maintaining a vigil at the cave entrance. Emily was there, along with John's parents and siblings. They could hear the progress reports, knew about the failed extraction attempt, but they still believed, they had to believe. The final hours by 10 p.m. on November 25th, John had been upside down for over 26 hours. The rescue teams were still working, trying to set up new anchor points. attempting different extraction techniques. But everyone could see the writing on the wall. John's voice over the communication system was getting weaker. His responses were delayed. The blood pooling in his head and chest was winning the fight against his cardiovascular system. Around midnight, John stopped responding to direct questions. He was still breathing, still occasionally mumbling something, but the clear, coherent communication was gone. The medical team on site confirmed what everyone already knew. His body was shutting down. Dr. Brandon Cowlis, one of the medical professionals coordinating the rescue, made the difficult decision to focus on keeping John as comfortable as possible, rather than continuing the extraction attempts. They increased the oxygen flow to his position and made sure he wasn't in pain, but the reality was setting in. There wasn't going to be a miraculous rescue. At 12:30 a.m. on November 26th, exactly 28 hours after he first became stuck, John Edward Jones died. He was still trapped in that narrow passage, 400 feet underground, surrounded by rescuers who had worked tirelessly to save him but ultimately couldn't overcome the basic physics of his situation. The impossible recovery. Now here's something that makes this story even more tragic. Even after John had died, the rescue teams couldn't retrieve his body. The passage was too narrow, the angles too severe. Any attempt to extract him would have required essentially destroying his remains, something his family understandably couldn't accept. The decision was made to seal Nutty Putty Cave permanently. On November 30th, 2009, crews filled the entrance with concrete and placed a memorial plaque at the site. John Edward Jones remains in that cave to this day, in what his family has chosen to view as his final resting place. It's a decision that haunts some of the rescuers who worked so hard to save him. They talk about the feeling of leaving someone behind, even though rationally, they know there wasn't any other choice. The cave had essentially become John's tomb, and disturbing it would have been more traumatic than healing for everyone involved. The aftermath. Emily Jones, John's widow, has spoken publicly about the experience in the years since. She has described the 28 hours of the rescue attempt as simultaneously the longest and shortest period of her life. Longest because of the agony of waiting, hoping, praying that somehow they'd get him out. Shortest because afterward, she realized those were the last hours her husband was alive. The last time she'd be able to communicate with him, even if it was through radio equipment 400 feet underground. She remarried in 2013 and has had more children. But she said that John's death taught her something profound about how quickly life can change. One moment you're planning Thanksgiving dinner and discussing Christmas vacation. The next, you're standing outside a cave entrance, waiting for news that will never come. The rescue workers involved in the operation have also struggled with the outcome. Many of them have been involved in successful cave rescues before and since. But John's case represents the limits of what's possible. Even with unlimited resources and expertise. Sometimes, physics wins. Sometimes, the Earth just doesn't give up what it's taken. The lessons learned. So what can we learn from John Edward Jones and the Nutty Putty Cave tragedy? First, even experienced cavers can make fatal mistakes. John knew what he was doing. He'd been in that cave system before, but in the darkness and complexity of underground passages, one wrong turn can be your last. Second, there are some situations where all the expertise and equipment in the world can't overcome basic physical limitations. The rescue teams that responded to John's situation were world-class. They had engineering support, medical expertise, and unlimited resources. But they couldn't change the fundamental reality that a human body can't survive being upside down in a space too narrow to allow extraction. Third, and perhaps most importantly, some places really weren't meant for humans. Nutty Putty Cave was formed by water erosion over thousands of years. Those narrow passages served a geological purpose, but they weren't designed with human access in mind. John's tragedy was a reminder that not every natural space is meant to be explored, no matter how adventurous we feel. The sealed cave. Today, if you drive out to the former entrance of Nutty Putty Cave, you'll find a small concrete seal and a bronze memorial plaque. It's a peaceful spot, surrounded by Utah's beautiful high desert landscape. The plaque reads, in part, John Edward Jones, loving husband, father, son, and brother. Died November 25, 2009, in Nutty Putty Cave. Despite the heroic efforts of local and visiting cavers, doctors, and numerous volunteers, John was unable to be freed from the cave. But there's something else at that site, something you can't see but can definitely feel. It's the knowledge that John is still down there, in that narrow limestone passage, in a place that has now become his permanent resting place. His family finds some comfort in knowing exactly where he is, in having a specific place to remember him, even if they can't visit him in any traditional sense. The cave itself continues to exist, of course. Water still moves through those limestone chambers, slowly continuing the erosion process that formed them millions of years ago. In a geological sense, John has become part of that process, part of the cave's ongoing story. The final turn. John Edward Jones went into Nutty Putty Cave as an experienced caver, a medical student, a young father excited to share his passion for underground exploration with his brother. He made one wrong turn, a mistake that could happen to anyone in the darkness and complexity of a cave system. That single decision, a left instead of a right in a passage 400 feet underground, cost him his life and changed dozens of other lives forever. His story isn't just about caving or rescue operations or even tragedy. It's about how thin the line is between adventure and disaster, between coming home to your family and never seeing them again. It's about the people who risk their own lives trying to save strangers, and the impossible decisions families have to make when someone they love is beyond help. But maybe most of all, it's a reminder that some boundaries exist for good reasons. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some passages are meant to remain unexplored. And sometimes, the most courageous thing you can do is turn around and go back the way you came. John Edward Jones never got that chance to turn around. But his story, sealed forever in Nutty Putty Cave, serves as a permanent reminder for the rest of us. Adventure is valuable. Exploration is important. But nothing, absolutely nothing, is worth more than making it home to the people who love you. If this story moved you, or if it made you think differently about risk and adventure, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Leave a comment below about a time when you had to make a choice between pushing forward and playing it safe. What did you choose, and why? Don't forget to subscribe for more deep dive documentaries into the stories that remind us how precious and fragile life really is. Because every adventure has a story, and every story deserves to be told. Thank you for watching John Edward Jones, trapped upside down in the Nutty Putty Cave. Until next time, remember that the best adventures are the ones you come home from.